after dark, kind of after dark. It's not that much after dark. And if I'm being honest, maybe after dusk dark. But I don't have a category for soapbox after dusk dark, so I'm just going to say soapbox after dark. Dark is at the end of it either way, even if it's not necessarily a sufficiently dark. So I want to give just kind of a brief rundown of what we know so far within regards to Ecuador and Julian Assange. This channel has been entirely supportive of Assange. I think he is vitally important, and I think it's vitally important to know what your government is doing. I think it is a massive jump with the shark to try to go after a man for publishing true information. And if indeed you're going after somebody who published everything that he's ever published has been true, what does it say about you? And what does this say about your motives and the world itself? He's a journalist. He's a journalist. I just wish more journalists would regard him as such, because if he's fair game, then so are they. But I want to talk about just basically what's taken place and what we know so far. So, Rafael Correa, as you know, gives Julian Assange asylum. Assange takes asylum because he was scared that he was going to be extradited to the United States. 7 years later, we find out that secret warrant was indeed there. And they are going to try to extradite him to the United States. That is going to be a courtroom fight in Britain, and if he's indicted or brought to the United States, there will be another courtroom battle in the United States. The United States is taking the perspective that Julian Assange is a hacker. They're not going after him for espionage, they're going after him for some kind of quasi-hacking operation. Good luck trying to prove that. But whether they can prove that or not in a court of law is almost secondary to the point that he has been stuck in a room for the past 7 years, and part of that time was with a government that was hostile to his very existence in that room. They eject him out of the embassy under suspicious pretenses. There are two things that are taking place right now within regards to Ecuador. There's a massive domestic scandal that has taken place that has wrapped Moreno, this gentleman, the gentleman that evicted Assange from the embassy and that made his life a living hell while he was in the embassy. There's a scandal involving him in what's called the INA papers, or INA papers. I'm going to read what that's about. It's some kind of real estate scandal with some kind of Chinese company. But he's massively corrupt. And people are beginning to notice. And not just people are beginning to notice. There are a large group of people that is very angry at him because the previous government, Rafael Correa, had a strong sense of identity, meaning from the standpoint of the country itself. He saw himself as a nation among nations and saw himself as being beyond this imperialism stage where the West, specifically the United States, run roughshod over South American countries. So you can imagine that a population that was on board with that sees what is taking place, sees his government withdraws asylum, sees his government give Assange up to effectively what amounts to the United States, meaning allows the United States to run roughshod over the interests of Ecuador, but also sees him taking these loans, meaning the reason he did it. So that's the second story that's taking place. A domestic issue is taking place in Ecuador itself that has wrapped the president. And you have people who are pissed off at him because they're looking at it as if he's under the thumb of the United States. They called him a traitor, somewhat of a turncoat. You've essentially given our interests over to foreign imperial powers. They're angry about this. They have a right to be angry about this. The secondary part to this, however, is that he's using WikiLeaks and Julian Assange to try to cover himself in the scandal, trying to say that WikiLeaks somehow publishes or was publishing this information to go after him. But essentially, he was using WikiLeaks and Julian Assange as some kind of scapegoat to try to cover himself from the scandal, essentially a wag the dog. The secondary part to this, and the other reason why these people are extraordinarily upset, is because they feel they've been sold out. One of the documents that WikiLeaks published showed one of the documents that WikiLeaks published um, showed that he was trying to get loans. Now, the previous president, Rafael Correa, had withdrew Ecuador from loans, meaning detangled Ecuador from any IMF loan. As you know, IMF loans are a way of controlling those various nations, essentially giving them loans they can never pay back and privatizing their resources with these kind of neoliberal policies for the economy itself. Rafael Correa had pulled that and was no longer entangled within those loans. Moreno, however, wanted the loans. And he wanted the loans so much, WikiLeaks published information showing that those loans from the IMF was going to be contingent upon them giving up Julian Assange. And what do you know? He secured millions of dollars in loans, tens of millions of dollars in loans. And just so happened, you have a smear campaign currently going on targeting Julian Assange. But you also had one that was going on in the run-up to this, meaning this channel, and there were others who were making the point that the smear campaign was targeted in a way in order to try to give justification for evicting Assange out of the embassy. And that's effectively what has taken place. And they are putting out pretty nasty stuff, even showing videos where they were surveilling him while he was in the embassy, kind of making a secondary point that he made that, yeah, they were surveilling me while I was in the embassy. Let's take a look at the loans for a moment. So, let's see, display. In February, Ecuador ended Correa's decade-long estrangement with the IMF, inviting the organization back into the country and accepting a $4.2 billion loan. I think I said million before, I meant billion, I'm sorry. $4.2 billion loan to support the economic policies of the Ecuadorian government, tying in with a broader international support effort totaling $10 billion. It wasn't just the IMF, it was also the World Bank. Correa has criticized the deal, saying Moreno is just trying to obscure his government's efforts to privatize the oil industry. Now, in doing so, however, the moment that he took these loans, he fired, if I'm not mistaken, over 10,000 workers. Correa is right. He would know. He was previous president of Ecuador. And just some people who would say, well, dude, there's no reason to believe that the loan that he got from the IMF in any way held any sway over his decisions. Not so much. Documents also published by WikiLeaks showed that the United States would use instruments like the IMF for unconventional warfare against other nations. In situations just like this, you can use it almost as a wing of the military in going after nations, either with a carrot or, in some cases, with a stick. Here's another point, and I don't know how many people know about this one. At one point, Julian Assange was in talks with Comey and members of the intelligence services in the United States. They were in touch with them because Julian Assange was working with them with the documents, meaning the CIA wanted to get their hands on the information that Julian Assange had, and they knew that he had the information, and there were certain parts of it that they wanted him to either redact or to not show. Julian Assange was working with them up to a certain point until there was a loss of trust. There was a break in the relationship. John Warner, if I remember this correctly, killed the talks. Now, they continued the talks after this kind of attempt to shut down the talks. But at this point, bad faith had been created. And Julian Assange, at this point, didn't trust any kind of conduit between the two parties. And he published the files. He published information. This embarrassed the CIA, of course. And at this point, the intelligence services wanted to get their hands on him. There were potential talks. I mean, I think that's fascinating because for the longest time, people have said, hey, if you really wanted to know what was going on with the Russia stuff, I mean, Julian Assange was the person that you should have talked to. That's the person who you would have went to. But they actually did try to talk to him. It was on something else, but at that point, the relationship had been tarnished. And for the last point, let me give you a little bit of information on the INA Papers. All right, the INA Papers. And one last point before going to the INA Papers. The politics within the United States itself. Donald Trump ran through the political campaign screaming how much he loved WikiLeaks. He loves WikiLeaks. He loves WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is just awesome. Now, fast forward 3 years later, where for 3 years, the media and many members of the Democratic Party has insisted, has alluded to or intimated that Donald Trump was somehow working with a foreign government, meaning he was somehow working with Vladimir Putin. They took this perspective as if it was almost de facto true, and everything, meaning information-wise, was always looked through that lens. He's somehow working with Vladimir Putin. He's somehow working with the Russian government. He's somehow, always likes strong men. His policies are in favor of Vladimir Putin. Didn't matter what the policies were, even when you got across them that look at all the bad stuff that he's done from the standpoint of Russian interests. Didn't really matter. They still pushed this narrative. Comey, or I should say Mueller, comes up, put a knife in this narrative. Regardless of him putting a knife in the narrative, for 3 years, the public has been inundated with this notion that Donald Trump was somehow working with Russia, and that Russia, the gateway between these two things, was somehow WikiLeaks, meaning WikiLeaks was somehow part of this incestuous relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin as being an intermediary in which the information was gathered. So Donald Trump is in a weird situation where when somebody brings a WikiLeaks to him, he looks into the camera and says, I have no idea what WikiLeaks is. The politics of this is something that he doesn't want to touch. The politics he doesn't want to touch because he's just barely extricating himself 3 years later from this notion that him and Russia was in some sort of relationship. And any ability that he had in order to be conciliatory with that government almost went out the window with it. We still have no level of normality with Russia, if such a thing exists. And by normality, I just mean any capacity of trying to bring down tensions has to some degree been tarnished by what has taken place over the last 3 years, especially with this narrative that Russia somehow attacked democracy itself because Hillary Clinton lost to reality shows. So that's the politics here in the United States, meaning Trump, regardless of how much he loved WikiLeaks during the campaign trail, at this point doesn't want to touch it because from him, or from his standpoint, it's radioactive. You can imagine that this creates a fraction or a faction or a split among Trump supporters. There's some Trump supporters that loves WikiLeaks because from their standpoint, he benefited them during the campaign. Others essentially go along with Trump, whatever Trump says. So let's take a look at the last part, the inner papers. And this video is going longer than I've wanted, but I think there was some good information in it. Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno, who's facing corruption probe brought forward by an opposition lawmaker relating to his offshore company in a case of illicit enrichment. I like that term, illicit enrichment. Lawmaker Ronnie Alega, told reporters that he received a dossier anonymously filled with documents that will implicate Lenin Moreno and his family in alleged crimes of corruption, perjury, and money laundering. The documents are known as the inner papers that links Moreno and the Chinese company Sinohydro that built the Coca-Cola Sinclair hydroelectric dam, which, according to the lawmakers, deposited $18 million in offshore company Corsa. Now, this company that account ends up being in Moreno's name. So I'll just read it. Vercosa is linked to the Ecuadorian businessman Canto Patino Martinez, who transferred money to more than 10 ghost companies in Panama, including an investment corporation, whose real owner is Edwin Moreno Garcias, brother of President Lenin Moreno, according to the leaked documents. It sounds like the president is massively corrupt. Fact of the matter is, you knew he was massively corrupt because he was willing to sell Assange and destroy any notion of Ecuador being a country among nations by destroying asylum in order to, let's say, gain favor with the Western powers, not to mention the $10 billion that they put in his pocket in order to carry favor with that opinion or to to what's the word I'm looking for? To loosen his grip on Assange, or to loosen his inhibition to burning any notion of Ecuador being a country among nations. Because at the end of the day, he was willing to sell somebody out on asylum, literally, for asylum. He was willing to do the opposite of what asylum was in order to get billions of dollars and to get the favor of Western nations. This is what's taken place so far. And by the way, this has gone so far as to where there's a warrant out for the previous president over some charge that sounds like it's trumped up. But also on another gentleman was with the previous government, putting out a warrant out for him, saying that he was kind of inciting some kind of illicit conduct or some kind of corruption conduct. Essentially, he told people that they should riot. That's what it boils down to. And they're saying that you're inciting some kind of criminality. So Ecuador is being rocked by various corruption scandals, not to mention the scandal associated with them just destroying any notion of Ecuadorian sovereignty in order to give up Assange. And like I said, you have people screaming traitor and people pissed off at him in Quito. I've been to Ecuador, beautiful country. The people are absolutely amazing. So self-effacing that for me to even conceive of them being out here protesting and pissed off in this way, it gets across the violation that's associated with what he's done. And I don't mean violation to Assange, I mean violation to the country's own notion of sovereignty. I'll leave it here. Thanks all. Oh, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. This video is done locally. Usually I do it live, and when I do it live, it's just kind of automatic. But no, if you enjoy the content and you find yourself coming back here often, please consider supporting the content through PayPal or Patreon. We give extra content to the patrons, and we're always trying to find new and more things to give. So, thanks all.